Hi and welcome to this tutorial that will explain how to work with shading corrections in LASX. Shading corrections is something that can be used to correct for uneven illumination of the sample. And in brief, the process is to use an LASX wizard to create a reference image. This reference image is then going to be applied to correct for uneven illumination. The images will be different depending on what optical components you have in the beam path, and therefore can be created depending on, for instance, what objective you're using, if you're using a contrast enhancing technique such as phase contrast or DIC, or even fluorescence. During this tutorial, I will walk you through the shading correction wizard and show you the effect of working with shading correction. The system that I will be using is a fully motorized DMI-8 with two 20x objective and one 40x objective. The sample that we're currently looking at is a kidney slice in regular transmitted light bright field. The shading correction is however not limited to inverted system, but can also work with other camera based systems such as upright systems, for instance, and also in stereo microscopes. To activate the shading correction, you can either click up here, or you can click on this button up here, or you could also click on the link shading text up here. You might have noticed that this button turned to red once we activated the shading correction, and that is because we haven't acquired any reference image in the system yet. So to do that, you need to get into the wizard, which you will find if you click on the link shading text up here, and then on the wizard tab. Before we go into the wizard, I just want to highlight the small eye over here. If you click on that and you allow your browser to show blocked content, you will get into a help section about shading correction. So this will give you more details about shading corrections and how to work with this shading correction wizard. Now the wizard contains three steps: one preparation phase, one acquisition phase where we will also acquire then the reference images, and one phase for restore the XYZ position, since we want to get back to the same position again. Starting with the preparation phase, the first thing that we need to do is to store our XYZ position, and we do that by just clicking here. This of course only works if you have a fully motorized system, but if you don't have a motorized system, you can also do this manually. Once we have stored this position, we should now move the stage to an outer area or a blank area of the specimen, or even outside the specimen, or we could even remove the specimen if that would be preferred. So right now I will move to an outer area. Like this one, for instance. Then we will lower the Z drive for a few microns and adjust the exposure time. In this case, which is quite convenient, I'm using the auto exposure of the camera. This completes the preparation phase. I'm now clicking on the Acquire tab. Once in here, you get an overview of the components that are currently being used. As one example, you can then see the three different objectives down here. You can see what kind of contrast method you're using. So right now, transmitted light bright field. Here you could also select other contrasting techniques. If your system has a magnification changer, that one will also be highlighted over here. If I now start with pressing start, the system is going to use the first objective. So if I had another objective selected, it would automatically move to the first one. From here, I will now press next. The system will now acquire the images. This is what you see right now. And after the acquisition, it will automatically move to the next objective. Again, of course, this is if you have a motorized system. If you have a manual, you would have to move the objective manually. Now the system tells us to adjust the exposure time up here, but since we have auto exposure already defined, I'm just clicking next again. It now acquires the reference image for this objective, and again we'll move to the third objective once the acquisition is done. It again tells us to adjust the exposure, but right now we have auto exposure, so we will not have to do that. You can also see that you get these small green icons down here. That means that the shading correction reference image has been acquired. I'm now taking the last acquisition for reference images. And now the acquisition part of the wizard is complete. Should you want to end the wizard during the acquisition, you can always press End Wizard down here. Should you want to retake a reference image for an individual objective, you could also, for instance, just highlight that objective and then you press single reference. That would acquire a new reference image for that specific objectives. If there is a reference image that you are not particularly happy with, you could also select to delete that reference image. We have now completed the acquisition tab, and we will therefore go into the Restore tab. I will actually now switch back to the objective that we were using from the beginning. I'm moving to Restore, and now I will restore the XYZ position. And we're back to where we started. I'm closing the wizard, and as you might have noticed, this button directly turned to green, which means that we have now activated the shading correction for that specific objective. If I want to deactivate the shading correction, you can click on this green button up here. And if you want to activate it, you click again. Now, as you can see, we had quite a uniform illumination already from the beginning, but I will later show you another situation where the effect is bigger. Right now, I will just show you the difference with this one. So I will capture one image with shading correction deactivated and one where it's activated. If I now go into the Projects tab, you see the deactivated shading correction and the activated shading correction. You can actually also see the actual correction, which is applied based on this shading. Should you not want to have your shading correction activated in your live view, you can click here and then you can deactivate Activate Link Shading Correction for Live Image. So if I deactivate this, I'm only applying now the shading correction if I press single image, capture image, or start. With the live view, I won't have the shading correction activated. You should note though that if you deactivate the shading correction and then activate it again, by default the linked shading correction for live image is ticked. That completes how to work with the wizard and acquiring reference image for shading correction, and now I will also show you another situation where the effect is bigger. I've now moved to the 4DX objective, and I'm also now using DIC as a contrast enhancing technique. It's still the same sample, and I have now a reference image saved for this particular setup, so DIC and 4DX objective. Now it's without shading correction, and now the shading correction is activated. So you can see already here the difference is bigger than the previous example. What I will do now is deactivate the shading correction, and I will go into a module that we call the navigator. In here we can acquire tile scans, so we can acquire multiple images and then stitch them together. I will first do that on this particular region without the shading correction. I'm pressing start, and now it's acquiring the images, and as you can see we have quite a significant amount of shading in this sample. After the images have been acquired, they are now being stitched together, and then we can view the stitched end results in this viewer here, clicking here. So as you can see, the images are actually very nicely stitched together, but still we're getting a lot of shading in this sample. So I will now repeat exactly the same experiment, but with shading correction activated. I'm activating the shading correction here, taking exactly the same tile. Already here you can see it's much nicer corrected. And now looking at the stitched end results, we have up one down here. And now the shading is gone and the images are nicely stitched together. Just to show you the difference, this is the one with the shading correction, and this is the one where shading correction is not activated. That completes this tutorial. I hope you have learned how to work with shading corrections, and I hope that you will use it a lot in the future. Thank you for listening.